Hi, I'm Jerry Bowyer. Welcome to this edition of Meeting of Minds. The mind we're meeting today is that of Jonathan Williams, who's the president and chief economist of the American Legislative Exchange Council, and he's here to talk about their important annual report, and it's recently come out, it's been updated, Rich States, Poor States. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Well, Jerry, thanks so much for the invitation, and greetings from the land of make-believe down here in Washington, D.C.
And from the land of where those ideas actually get tested, Wade and Uni Tekel Farsam found wanting in many cases out here in the States. But that's the beauty of it, right? The 50 laboratories of democracy and what you've been able to do with this report that you've been doing for some time, along with, friends like Steve Moore, right? And Arthur Laffer, been able to track how those laboratories of democracy are doing in terms of freedom. What are the big trends you've seen?
Well, it's really been fascinating now for 19 years to work on this report with those two phenomenal co-authors. And it was my day one job here at ALEC. And they said, wouldn't it be great if we produced a report, and going along the lines of exactly what you were saying there, of the 50 laboratories of democracy, to give ALEC members, which, as you know, we have almost 2,000 ALEC members who serve in the state legislative chambers in all 50 states, as well as concerned policymakers and citizens from around the country, a way to measure their states versus the other 49 to see what they're doing well and hopefully do more of it, and see what they're doing not so well and hopefully avoid some of the mistakes of the states that have gotten it wrong for so long. And so what we chose 15 different variables to look at in the report, things like economic freedom, tax rates, labor policy, regulations, things that we know matter for economic growth. But then also, I think just as importantly, Jerry, and you're so familiar with all the different ranking types that are out there, and I think it's inherently good to have different types of ranking systems, but I think ours is unique in many respects in that it only focuses on variables that state lawmakers directly can control in their state capital and can directly change in a given year to either make themselves better or not. And so the trends I think we've seen, to your question, is that no mistake about it. Over the last number of years, we have seen an incredible movement towards states becoming more and more aware that they are competing not just against their bordering states, but against all states across the country. And whether they like it or not, there's no such thing as building a wall along your state line to keep things in or out. This is an open market. This is exactly 250 years later what the founders had hoped for, is we have these states now competing with each other, and the best ideas will win and rise to the top. And so the trend is states are becoming more and more aware of that. And I think in many cases, at least for 30, 35 states, they're moving generally in a direction that's making themselves more competitive for job creation, for families, for lots of virtuous things. And then you have a few of the states that haven't quite figured it out yet. And that's, of course, where every example of bad examples do serve a good reason to showcase the things that don't work. And, how in the world, for instance, Jerry, is California losing people, right? I mean, if we've spent time there, every time I've gone to California, I wonder how in the world the policymakers in Sacramento get it so wrong that people want to leave what is perhaps the most beautiful piece of real estate on Earth. And a lot of that has to do with the public policy choices.
Yeah, I mean, they certainly have the weather advantage, but there's a cachet to it. But they also have, arguably an even more important economic advantage, which I think has maybe muted the freedom signal for a while, which is the network effects of innovation. Innovative groups and companies, starting with Hewlett Packard, and how an ecosystem came out of that, and we get Silicon Valley. There's a famous, venture capitalist who said, if I can't ride my bike to it, I won't invest in it. That's how geographically concentrated this sort of singularity of economic growth was. And so I think that kind of maybe masked for some time the negative effects of policy. That, look, you had to live in San Francisco, you had to live in Silicon Valley, you had to be wherever, you had to be in Hollywood if you were in movies. And so we'll put up with the terrible policy because you just physically have to be there. And it feels like that network effect is now maybe dissolving a little bit or disaggregating. What do you think?
I think that's exactly right. And you could say the same in some respects for Manhattan in the financial
Yeah.
sector. You heard even a number of years ago, Mayor Bloomberg at the time would say, this we're a luxury good. People will pay whatever it takes to live and work in Manhattan. And that's not the case anymore, clearly, as you've seen the effects there dissipate. And, a huge percentage of folks in that industry have moved into places like South Florida and left, Manhattan altogether, never to return. But I mean, California, the same story. And you have places like Silicon Slopes in Salt Lake, and you have Austin, Texas, and you have other great areas for innovators to have that hub and that the network effects without paying the taxes and dealing with the ridiculously costly economic policies that California and New York have foisted on employers and employees. And one of the reasons why I think we've seen this, Jerry, it's coming out of the pandemic. We've seen a uptick in the net domestic migration from state to state as employers rightly gave their employees more and more flexibility as offices were locked down in many of the blue states, as we know, for far too long. And we had the scenario then where employees were able to work from wherever they'd like remotely, and would then became resistant to coming back into the office for a 5-day work week. And we still see that in certain industries across the country. And you really then have to look at the value creation for the employee to say what makes sense and how can I keep my best employees. And if it means allowing them to work outside of the HQ and outside of the major metropolitan area to give them a better quality of life at a lower cost of life, that equation for employers was pretty straightforward. And therefore, we've seen this phenomenon that we track every year in rich states, poor states, of Americans voting with their feet across state lines for more economic opportunity and a better quality of life. We've seen a huge uptick in that. And I think that has been a driver also to reinforce the benefits when states get it right on lower taxes and things like education freedom to give parents the opportunity to give their kids the best, either homeschool, private school, charter school education, all the above, even better public schools. That is a huge part of the equation as well when you look at why people go across state lines and move.
For nearly 3,000 years, Homer's The Odyssey has shaped Western imagination. It tells the story of Odysseus as he faces monsters, shipwrecks, false comforts, and impossible choices on his long journey home. As one of the foundational works of Western literature, Homer's epic is more than mythology. It explores permanent questions about courage, duty, loyalty, family, leadership, temptation, and the search for home. In one of the epic's defining moments, Odysseus rejects the offer of immortality from the goddess Calypso, choosing instead the long and difficult journey home. His decision reveals one of the central themes of the Odyssey, that a life of duty, family, and home is greater than a life devoted to comfort or glory. Achilles chose glory. Odysseus chose home. That's why Hillsdale College has released its newest free online course, The Odyssey. Taught by Professor Benedict Whalen, the course reveals why Homer's masterpiece remains one of the greatest works of Western literature. Find this free course at hillsdale.edu/start now. The Odyssey from Hillsdale College. Go to hillsdale.edu/start now.
It's no secret that we have a lot of heart for truck drivers. That's why Racetrack High Flow Diesel stores have great services and amenities you need to keep on trucking. There's accessible and convenient parking, dedicated truck lanes, certified CAT scales, clean facilities, and hot, made in-house food. Yep, we're more than just your daytime meal stop. You could even say we're trucking's best-kept secret. Racetrack, whatever gets you going.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that, ironically, the authoritarian tendencies of Fauciism were liberty's kind of best friend, because created this environment where, first of all, we all got a gigantic lesson in monetary economics. Turns out more money chasing fewer goods does cause inflation. Thank you, Milton Friedman, vindicated from beyond the grave. Thank you, Biden and Fauci, for that. It broke up the kind of the monopoly of you have to show up for work, and all of a sudden now we're Zooming in or Teamsing in or whatever, and we realize we don't have to live in tyrannical, people's republics of San Francisco in order to be part of the network. We got to see what the teachers in public schools were teaching kids, because they're sitting next to us at the dining room table, and we can listen in on that, and which has caused a huge exodus from public schools. And we also learned who we can trust and who we can't trust. So it was a painful lesson, but I think, all in, that painful lesson has made us a freer country. They had their designs and Providence had higher designs, made us a little freer. So I want you to take on this race to the bottom argument. Well, all that this is, when states compete against one another, all you're doing is moving economic growth around, right? Texas is stealing growth from California or New York. I mean, I know it's a nonsensical argument. You've probably heard it more than anybody because it's the kind of the standard way to try to deny the findings in your report. How would you answer it?
Well, that's probably not the craziest argument. There is one that we get even sometimes more than that from people like Paul Krugman, a former New York Times fake news economist and former Enron advisor, editorial board.
You weren't going to say it. I was Enron advisor, Paul Krugman.
And Paul Krugman, literally with a straight face, as we've debated him, will say that, people are only going to the South and to places like Texas for better weather because now that there's air conditioning and, you can enjoy warm winters. And now with the advent of air conditioning, people are going to the South. And it's like, nobody in their right mind has ever left California and gone to Texas for better weather. Why they're going there, of course, is more opportunity. And it's not a zero-sum game, right? I mean, these are people that would not have been able to expand businesses and hire more individuals if they were stuck with the tyrannical regime of overregulation, overtaxation, and government involvement in California by taking more and more out of that ability to hire more individuals. And this is why that first argument you mentioned is just wrong, and that this is not a static scenario. All things economy are dynamic, and when those innovators and job creators are given more and able to keep more of those earnings, they're able to plow that back into hiring, creating more job opportunities, and creating better goods. And so this whole argument about the race to the bottom is clearly about, is a flawed argument. It does get thrown around, but people don't really pay that too much attention now, just because of the numbers and the amount of the ability of those individuals, not just the employers, but the individuals, to have a better quality of life in the new states of residence because of these moves is just something that you can't deny.
Yeah, and also, air conditioning is not exactly a brand new technology, right? I mean, I think the effects of it, it's a 1930s technology. FDR got air conditioning. So I think the effects of that were already baked in. I think the recent migrations, we might need another variable to explain the recent migrations. Again, people moving. I don't think weather explains it, right? Because often these are not north-south moves. Often these are east-west to center moves. Pretty similar weather. And I'm not sure anyone's moving to Tornado Alley because of the weather or because of air conditioning. But maybe they're trying to get away from higher taxes. I mean, it's hard to believe the arguments that someone like Krugman made. The guy's got a Nobel Prize.
That's right. And people forget that, he's got his Nobel Prize in basically international free trade, right? And so it's kind of strange how it's come full circle to this degree. But
it doesn't apply the trade arguments to states where they should apply just as well as across national borders.
Exactly.
Except for the currency effects, you still have the tax and regulatory differentials.
That's exactly right. Now, one point, though, also just on this kind of absurd argument of the South and air conditioning, look across the Southeast, and you have some pretty wide differentials across states. The states that have embraced good free market economics and lower taxes for a very long time, like Florida, Texas, and Tennessee, more recently North Carolina and South Carolina. But then you have your laggards in the region like Louisiana and Mississippi that have now begun to catch up, but they have done so because of the pressure and this competitiveness among the southeastern states, and realizing and having this acknowledgement that basically they were falling behind by standing still, which is a key lesson from rich states, poor states, is when you are surrounded, especially by no income tax states, like those states are in the Southeast, they had zero path for growth going forward long term, competing against the 0% personal income tax. And so people like Governor Landry in Louisiana has done heroic efforts to become more competitive as a state, use school choice, and just to begin to put Louisiana more on a growth path. You have Mississippi that is in a pathway to zero on their personal income tax on current law. They have triggers in place, just like Kentucky and Oklahoma would do to eliminate their personal income tax if nothing else is done. And so I think even within that region, obviously the Southeast is a pretty diverse region. People like to think of it as a monolithic region. It's clearly not. And there were some big differences between how those state governments went about doing business. And it's clear that the leaders of that region, like Tennessee, Texas, and Florida, are the ones that are attracting the most job creation and population. And everyone else has been trying to catch up for now a couple of decades.
Yeah. I mean, what I'm hearing is, on balance, the competitive nature of the American system. And I mean, 250 years ago, we didn't quite have this, right? 250 years ago, we kind of were going into an Articles of Confederation where there was protectionism between the colonies, right? And eventually they figured that out, setting up the real federalist system that we have now. When we had that, setting up that system didn't just create, I mean, just think of it as like a sports league. If you have more competition, you have better playing from everybody. Like the whole league gets better, not just the winners, because everyone wants to be a winner. There are consequences for winning and losing. And so we have higher growth as a country because we have competition between these states. If someone can move from a place where they were going to be flat with their business to a place where they're going to grow 10% a year, that the whole country is benefited from that, not just the destination state.
That's such a great point. And then just kind of thinking through also just historically what this has meant, because you do have that competitive effect, especially in a couple of regions. I mean, the Southeast we've talked about, they're a competitive bunch anyways, SEC football and the like, they just know how to go at it. And then, you look at the Mountain West, another very competitive region where the states there have been jockeying for years to become more competitive. And I think those two areas of competition, we've seen the most upward mobility of states over time, just because of the trendsetters in those regions. I mean, the Midwest has seen some positive moves in the right direction, and then you have the stagnant regions like the left coast and the Northeast that, as a percentage of the overall economy now, have been shrinking for quite some time, and certainly population as well as a result.
I wonder about the interaction between the economics and the politics here, in the sense that if you have mass exodus of the entrepreneurial class from some of these regions, do we end up with a situation where it's almost like the sanction of negative economic growth doesn't really matter? It's hard to get the talent back, given a traumatic experience, and you create a political dynamic left behind, almost of like that death spiral, that you've got like a makers and takers kind of thing going on. The makers leave. The takers don't know how to make, and they just get more and more aggressive with the taking until there's no makers left, and the political culture is just essentially uncorrectable. And you say, well, but things get bad enough. Well, no, I mean, things in Somalia get bad and they get worse, right? Now, I'm not saying California is Somalia, but I am saying that there might be a situation where if there's enough migration, they can't get out of it, because the people who believe in growth left, and the people left behind don't understand growth, and the pain isn't all that helpful to them, because they'll just blame the makers all the more rather than learn from the experience.
Well, it's an interesting scenario, and it's I grew up in a town, Saginaw, Michigan. You've heard me tell the story some. I mean, Saginaw was a town of about 100,000 population back several decades ago, going back I think to the census of 1960. Today we're hovering below 50,000. So we've seen this massive outmigration. What does that mean? It means the folks that graduate from K-12 and from institutions of higher learning don't have jobs there, so they automatically leave in many cases. You're then left with this dynamic you talk about to some degree, and then of course you've got the inherent like long time established wealth that they don't need to make it because they're sitting on a trust fund, and there's not a ton of that in Saginaw, Michigan, but in some of these, let's say the northeastern states, you have a lot of that where they don't need to make money because their family or their grandparents or great grandparents did, and they're the trust fund babies, and they have their foundations that they live off of, and they don't really care as much. So you have that in terms of the wealthy as well. That's a dynamic. That's where you see these kind of billionaires for tax increases, is because guess what, they're not paying taxes anyways, because they're making money through the foundation space as
They
well.
control enormous fortunes, and they have a good standard of living, right? Because they're getting consulting fees off of it. But the billions are not taxable billions. So you have a nice mansion, you're doing well, you've got servants, but the hyper wealth is away from the tax man. So, I mean, I think a lot of people don't realize taxes on the wealthy are really taxes on the ascendant. They're not taxes on established wealth. Established wealth is generally tax protected. They're people coming up. The person becoming a millionaire or becoming a deca millionaire or whatever, that's who gets hit by that. They might own some auto dealerships or like a few factories or something like that, and they're growing. That's who gets hit by that stuff, not the uber wealthy.
That's exactly right. I mean, that's the travesty. When I travel, I've been to all 50 states now, as you know, Jerry. And when I travel the country, I mean, that's the travesty of it. When states get it wrong when it comes to public policy and their taxes are too high and the regulation stifling of employment, you do see that stifling of upward mobility, right? And that is the heart of what the problem is with so many of these bad policies. The established wealth will be fine. Those that are poor are still going to have issues and less opportunity. But it's those that are of that entrepreneurial class that do want to go up the next ladder on the ladder. It's a huge disincentive for that, and then it's a fight or flight response. Then, right? It's either people are tired of dealing with that, and they say enough with California. As good as the weather is, as good as so many of the factors are of California, we will leave and go someplace else. And to the policymakers that still think places like New York or California are immune from that, I point them just to the comments from Governor Kathy Hochul not long ago of New York, who had basically was down in Florida begging individual business owners to come back to the state to say, we need your revenue, come back to our state. And this is after years of basically doing everything in their power, the liberals that run New York government, to kick businesses out and make it difficult for them to operate in the state. And now they have the gall to come back and say, we need your tax revenue, so come on back. But isn't that the mentality?
It is. It's not exactly negotiating from a position of strength. So one of the issues that I've been kicking around lately, you and I haven't talked about this, but it seems to me it's adjacent to rich states, poor states, is the trend that we're seeing on redomiciling. So it can be the redomiciling of the state of incorporation, the Dexit, as they say, from Delaware to Texas, mostly to some degree Nevada. Or it could be headquarters, or it could be operations, but that movement of essentially the center of gravity of companies. And there's different layers to this, right? Like if you redomicile your state of corporation, you're probably not changing your tax situation a lot, but you might be changing the legal environment. Whereas a headquarters, that might be more of a tax arbitrage thing. Apply, if you would, the insights that you've gained from doing this thing for 19 years, and still doing it, to this issue of redomiciling or moving headquarters, et cetera, of corporations.
Well, it's a huge development over these 19 years, and you look at who the leaders were of the Fortune 500 companies, or the S&P 500 that are domestic, and you see where New York and California used to be on that list, or even places like Illinois or New Jersey, and you've seen how they've all declined really substantially when it comes to the number of full headquarters locations, and they're going to places like Texas and Tennessee and Florida.
I mean, we were once one of the great corporate headquarters of America. That's almost all gone now.
Exactly. And so that, huge tax and regulatory policy implications of driving that. And then more recently, I mean, certainly with the effect of the Delaware, Dexit, as you mentioned, Elon Musk made a big headline around that. But, I just did a show in Delaware for public radio there, and it's something like 60% of the revenue, tax revenue coming in to the state of Delaware is revolved around that and the supply chain of the legal firms that cater to that. So, I mean, we're talking about a massive amount of the state's revenue comes from. I mean, it is the goose that lays the golden egg, literally, for the state of Delaware. And if they were to lose, it seems like they're strangling it a little bit.
Basically overturning the Elon pay package when shareholders had supported it. I don't know, maybe I'm overstating this. I mean, I have friends who are like big boosters for Delaware, but it does seem like they're flirting with, again, might be the network effect thing, taking that for granted, with that sort of number one status. Do you have the same impression?
Yeah, and there's also, I mean, just the competitive effects there too, and that like other states see that as a potential upward trajectory for their state and revenue and economic activity. And so I think you have South Dakota, you have Texas, you have other states that are vying for that business more aggressively today. And all of a sudden, that inherent advantage that Delaware had had or the Chancellery Court for so many years is drying up. And, or just the example that I know you've talked about, Jerry, and we've talked about a lot with our friend Derek Kreifels, is ExxonMobil's decision, right, to
Right.
change incorporation there and the from New Jersey to Texas, where Delaware in the old days would have been certainly, you would think, probably the front runner to gain that business of the filing from New Jersey to Delaware. Probably not that much in the mix from what I could read. And, especially important to that is, of course, the kind of the woke proxy shareholder services that advised against the move to Texas, and shareholders saw through it. So that was a very good development.
Well, yeah, and that's kind of, that hasn't been heralded much. I mean, obviously you're like in the know policy wise, so you understand how earth shattering that was. The proxy advisory services came out strongly against it. They were strongly against the Elon pay package. They were against this. They were against the Dell redomicile. And I think the Dell redomicile vote was 91%. So that's a repudiation. So you've got these groups, these proxy advisory services. Now, anyone who listens to this show knows about them because we talk about that a lot here, right? This is Proxy Central around here. But as a reminder, they were once terrifying. There was a time when I've heard CEOs say, don't mess with ISS. Don't mess with Glass Lewis. They can, they come after your board members. They come after your pay package. Just do whatever they want. And now, essentially, CEOs are thumbing their nose at them. And I don't know what they were thinking when they came out against this, because they were going to lose. And so basically they're saying, hey, trust us. We know what's good for shareholders. And shareholders are saying, we're shareholders. We know what's good for shareholders.
That's right.
Not these entities that are 4 steps away, from skin in the game, from the actual owner of the investor, the person who, the pension person, right? The person who generated the wealth that's invested. I think we're going to see a lot of momentum on this redomicile thing.
And the more you see it in the news, I think you're just going to have more and more states say, hey, what can we create to put ourselves in the game? If this is a jump ball and some of these companies looking to get out of these states, what do we need to do? And like I said, I mean, I've already seen it in South Dakota, as I'm sure you have. You see it in Texas and other free market states generally, where then it just makes more sense to align the domiciling with the headquarter and just the operations of the company anyways.
Yeah, so we're pretty much out of time, but let me just end off with you've been doing this for 19 years. You just recently produced this again, the Rich States, Poor States, along with Art Laffer and Steve Moore, our mutual friends. What are you most excited about that you've seen?
Well, I think, Utah's been number one in our economic outlook score for all 19 editions of Rich States, Poor States. So the pace setter's been there. New York's been 50th out of 50. That doesn't surprise you for nearly every edition. But what most excites me is the turnaround stories. The states that started in the bottom half or the bottom 10 have moved up now to middle of the pack or even being competitive states. I mean, Ohio this year was the big winner, moving up 10 slots in economic outlook just this last year. And Ohio was a state was in the bottom 5 in economic outlook in the first edition of Rich States, Poor States. Progressive governor Ted Strickland was governor at the time, fighting on tax increases. And Ohio had been an out-migration state for many years, 40 years straight, really. And then just the continued turnaround over time. And then right now, our Senate president there, Rob McCauley, on the ALEC board of directors, he's working with Vivek Ramaswamy right now as well in Ohio, working for governor and lieutenant governor, as you know, out there. And Rob McCauley spearheaded this effort to make Ohio a flat tax state. 2.5% flat tax is 2.75% flat tax is what they ended up at. And Ohio today is 15th best in economic outlook, where they started out in the bottom 5. There's a lot of great stories like that, but that turnaround from Ohio is incredible. And that 40 years of out-migration year after year have now turned into positive in-migration after they enacted education freedom and these free market tax and regulatory reform. So if it can be done in a place like Ohio, and it somewhat pains me as a Michigan Wolverines fan to say this, but if it can be done in Ohio, and that turnaround can be so stark in a fairly limited amount of time when you think of totality of state policy, that should be an optimistic note for every state.
Yeah, well, I think I'm going to add just like a little bit of a modification of what I said before about the doom loop. I think it depends what the core of the liberal coalition is in the state. So if the core of the liberal coalition is California, basically Marxist, essentially the woke mob, they are impervious to data and reality. But if the coalition is industrial state, blue collar, private sector union, Ohio, Pennsylvania, right, Michigan, then in a situation like that, my people, right, we're practical. So for a long time, we thought, stick it to the man, and every CEO was the monopoly guy with the monocle and stick it to the man. But we're practical enough to say, oh, wait a minute. We didn't stick it to the man. We stuck it to ourselves. And so the Ohios and the Pennsylvanians and the Michigans, I think, are more susceptible to the political realignment that says, oh, wait a minute, we've had enough deindustrialization. We get it. A poor man never gave me a job. So I think that the dissolution of the liberal coalition, where the blue collar part of that coalition, more pragmatic. What my friend Michael Novak said, they're not the Brie and Chablis liberals, right?
That's right.
They, okay, like my pop, right? The people I grew up with, they get it. They vote differently now and are being rewarded. In Pennsylvania, we're doing great with the data centers and the fracking. So there's that pragmatism, I think, that you're going to see from the industrial states that you might not see from a California or New York.
100%. And, it's not isolated to Ohio. It's West Virginia's had a great turnaround from a century of real economic problems, and same formula. When you combine education freedom and more economic opportunity for workers and for individuals and employers, it's a great formula that works. As Art Laffer likes to say, it's not rocket surgery. It's kind of basic economics 101. You change those incentives and make your state a state that can be a magnet for job creators and individuals and families and make it work. States can turn themselves around in a relatively short amount of time.
Yeah, well, they do the rocket surgery in Texas now when SpaceX moved there. So Jonathan Williams, president of American Legislative Exchange Council and co-author of Rich States, Poor States, thank you so much for being with us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry. Always great to join you.